everybody, and welcome to ARE Live. I'm Lauren. I'm the Content Marketing Manager here at Black Spectacles, and joining me today is Chris Hopstock, who is our Architect Education Specialist and our host for ARE Live. Chris is flying solo today. He's going to be talking about zoning ordinances, which I feel like I remember is one of your favorite topics, Chris. Yes?
Yeah, definitely. It is. And I have a
Cool.
lot of experience with it.
Awesome. So if you think of any questions that you'd like to ask Chris during today's episode, make sure to drop them in the Q&A feature on the side. We'll be reading through those at the end. There also will be a page in our ARE community after the episode if you think of more questions that you want to ask after the broadcast. Our next episode of ARE Live will be on July 20th, and it'll be all about CE. But we're trying something new this time. We want to know what questions you all have that you want us to cover on the episode. So you can use the chat throughout this episode to drop any topics that you have. Or you can also use the community page as well. And we'll be reading through those to hopefully pick a topic for that episode. To learn more about the study materials that Black Spectacles offers or to watch this episode again after, go to blackspectacles.com. Chris will be sharing his screen during today's episode, so we recommend watching the webinar to better see how he works through all the material. There'll also be a recording that we'll send out and post on our website after the episode airs. So Chris, go ahead, take it away.
Yeah, let's do it. So before we get started with the 5 questions that I have today, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what zoning ordinances are, why they're important, and sort of how they came about. So zoning ordinances aim to manage growth and development in areas by controlling how large buildings are, both in terms of height and area, but also in terms of footprint. They also control things like where they're placed on the site, usually by requiring certain types of setbacks from different types of lot lines. And lastly, they govern the types of uses that are allowed in certain districts. Zoning ordinances break cities or rural areas or just areas in general into different districts, and they'll have different rules that apply to all the buildings within that specific district. So when it comes to uses, there might be residential districts, commercial districts, and industrial districts. Those are the typical breakdowns of zoning uses. So in many ways, you can say that zoning is concerned with the building envelope and outward, and really how the building is perceived from the outside. That's pretty different from the building code, which is really about governing life safety and accessibility issues. And I think a simple way to think about that compared to zoning is that the building code is concerned with the building envelope and everything inside of the building. So with that, why do we even have zoning ordinances? I'll go into a little bit of the history of zoning in the United States. You're not going to get a question on the ARE about history, so don't try to memorize these dates. They're not all that important, although I find them interesting. But I think it's important to think about why this all came about so that it helps you remember really the purpose of zoning. The first comprehensive zoning ordinance in the United States was the 1916 New York City zoning ordinance, a little over 100 years ago. And it was really a response to a number of things. There was this building in downtown Manhattan called the Equitable Building that was built in 1915, and that is a massive building if you're ever in New York City. It's over 500 feet tall. I think it's 536 feet tall, and there are 0 setbacks. It just goes straight up. And as a result, it casts about a 7-acre shadow across lower Manhattan. So you can imagine a lot of people were upset by this building being built in 1915, particularly neighboring landowners who felt that it devalued their neighboring properties. There are a couple of other factors that went into it. New York City in the early 1900s was a pretty big industrial hub in the United States, kind of different from today. But these industrial uses were starting to encroach on, they were running out of space in their industrial areas, and they were starting to encroach on some fashionable areas of the city, particularly the Ladies Mile shopping district. So again, landowners in the Ladies Mile district weren't so happy about that and wanted some regulation that would stop that from happening. There were also a lot of tenement houses in New York City that were generally unsafe for folks to be living in, super crowded. There was a housing shortage in the early 1900s in New York City. So another aim of zoning was to improve the living conditions by requiring some light and air into these housing units. So with that little history, you might be asking, why do we need both zoning ordinances and the building code? Why can't there just be one set of standards in the building code maybe that governs all this stuff. Well, zoning is really uniquely tailored to the individual area that it's governing. So I've got a couple of examples here. This is a zoning map of the Upper East Side of New York City. You could see Central Park on the left there. This is a really dense zoning map as it needs to be for New York City. The regulations in urban areas govern large buildings that are going to be built really close to each other on relatively small lots. If you compare that to the zoning map of a really rural area, this is a small town in upstate New York that I live in and I'm on the planning board in. The requirements for a community like this are super different. The pinkish red area in the center is kind of like the town center, if you will. You could see the lots are a little bit smaller there. And the different shades of green represent different residential area. They're all residential, but different densities are allowed in each area. The dark green being the least dense and like pretty forested area. So that's kind of why we need different zoning ordinances, and there's not a single zoning ordinance you're going to need to know about for the purpose of the ARI, because it's different everywhere. It needs to respond to the local community, and usually a local planning board or some sort of governmental body like that will create the zoning in their jurisdiction that's specific to their needs. That's very different from building codes. Life safety in this rural area and New York City, it's all pretty much the same. A residential building is going to need the same smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors, no matter where it's located, for example, the same egress requirements. So a standardized building code makes sense, whereas a standardized zoning ordinance probably does not. So with that little bit of history, we're going to jump into the first question here. And I'm going to turn my video off because I'll be looking down most of the time writing on the tablet here, but I'll return to video when we get to the Q&A session. So like I said, we've got 5 questions here. I'm going to start by reading the question and then we will go through it. So an architect is working to prepare the construction documents for a new construction office building in a downtown area. The local authority having jurisdiction, or AHJ, requires zoning information to be placed on separate sheets from life safety compliance information. Which of the following should the architect place on the zoning compliance sheets? And we're going to check the 3 that apply. So this question really gets at what I was just talking about, the difference between zoning and the building code and what's covered specifically here under zoning ordinances. And we'll talk through some of these answers, and sometimes something is covered by both, but in different ways and from a different perspective. So let's go through these answer choices here. So the first one, allowable building height per table 504.3. I think this one seems correct. We just talked about how zoning governs how big a building can be. If you're reading this, you might see the word height and think that height's definitely governed by zoning and move on and mark this as correct. But you need to be sure to read the entire choice here. Specifically, table 504.3 is a building code table. And that table considers the occupancy classification, which is a building code term, not a zoning term, as well as construction type and whether or not the building has sprinklers to figure out how big the building can be. From a life safety perspective, that's all about not having a really big building, for example, built out of combustible wood construction that's going to be a fire hazard for the occupants inside, and also be really difficult for firefighters to manage the fire if there's a disaster there. So while this may seem correct, this is really talking about allowable building height in the building code. So we're going to mark that as incorrect. The next 2 are pretty similar to each other. I would say in testing tip, if you see 2 choices like this that are similar, I would assume that only one of them is going to be correct, and that is the case here. So let's look at the first one, use group. Remember that zoning ordinance are concerned with compatible uses being located near each other. So zoning ordinances tend to break different types of uses into use groups and say which ones are allowed in certain areas. So this one is correct, whereas occupancy classification, it seems really similar to use group, but occupancy classification is a building code term, and it breaks it breaks types of uses into similar categories to how a zoning ordinance might do it. But again, it's concerned really with life safety, and really the occupancies are thinking about a couple of things. How many people are likely to be in this space at a given time? So a residential occupancy group, you're probably not packing people into an apartment all of the time, whereas an assembly group, people are going to be a lot closer together. You're going to have a higher occupant load, and that's going to affect a number of things, egress in particular. So occupancy classification is really a building code issue and not an answer here. Required setbacks. This is a good one and definitely something that's governed by a zoning ordinance. Setbacks are done for a couple of reasons. Usually setbacks are required to create continuity in a certain area. Like you might have an area where the historic buildings in the area all have front yards. So a zoning ordinance might require front yards thereafter so that all of the street faces of the buildings are kind of similarly located with respect to the street. You should also be familiar with rear yards. Those are usually required so that there's some space between buildings that back up to each other on a block. And finally, side yards are usually required in lower density areas where there might be driveways between buildings or there's just a general desire for some space between buildings. So required setbacks is correct. The fifth option here is kind of similar to required setbacks, but just like use group and occupancy classification, this is really a building code issue that has to do with fire resistance, just like the choice says. So fire resistance based on lot lines is something that comes from IBC table 602. That talks about how high of a fire rating in terms of hours you need based on how close you are to a lot line and what types of occupancy you have in the building. The idea of this requirement is that a really high hazard occupancy, let's say an H occupancy, some sort of industrial use that's right at the lot line is going to be relatively dangerous to neighboring buildings. If there's a fire in that building, it's pretty likely that it could spread to the neighboring building if it's located right on the lot line. So there's a required fire rating there, probably 3 hours or something like that. So this might seem very similar to setbacks, but in fact is a building code requirement. And then finally, floor area ratio. I think it's probably the most obviously correct answer here. It's definitely a zoning requirement. And for just to explain floor area ratio, it's a number that zoning ordinances prescribe that when you multiply it by the lot area, it tells you how many total square feet you can build. And I want everyone to remember that you multiply FAR by the lot area, not the area that's left over after setbacks, to find the allowable floor area. We'll have a few examples of that later on in this presentation, but for now, just remember that FAR is floor area is FAR times the lot area. So I think with that, we've got a pretty good basic understanding of what zoning's covering, and I think we can move on to some specific questions about zoning. And those are the correct answers again. Let's take a look at this question. So we've got an exhibit here, a site plan. I like to read the question first and then figure out what on the exhibit is going to be applicable. There's usually some erroneous information on these drawings that you'll need to consider, and there is some here. So let's read the question. Refer to the exhibit. An architect is working on a detached pool house addition to a historic home. The local zoning ordinance has the following requirements in addition to setback requirements noted on the site plan. The AHJ considers pool houses to be accessory structures. So we've got a maximum floor area ratio of 0.3 and a note here that accessory structures do contribute to the floor area. We've got a maximum impervious area of 20% and a note that this applies to structures and pools only. And we've got a maximum accessory structure area of 800 square feet. And the question is, what's the maximum allowable area of this pool house? So looking at this question, there's 3 bullet points, and consequently there's going to be 3 things that could govern the size of this pool house, and we're going to need to find the one that's the most restrictive. The last requirement here is an absolute requirement, so nothing can be above 800 square feet. So you're going to want to make sure you make specific note of that one. And no matter what answer you pick, it should not be higher than 800 square feet. I will say if you're pressed for time and you feel the need to skip this one and just throw out a guess, 800 square feet might be a good guess because it's going to be really hard to guess the exact number on a fill in the blank question. But if there's a kind of like a hint like this in the question that it could be 800 square feet, I would just personally guess that. So we'll move on to the slide so I have a little bit more room to write here. So we're going to need to analyze both the floor area ratio and the impervious area to determine which of those, if any, is lower than the 800 square foot absolute requirement, and then we'll figure out how big our pool house can be. So starting with FAR first, we'll first find the maximum allowable total FAR, and since the existing house uses some of that FAR, we're going to need to subtract the existing floor area from that maximum allowable floor area to find what's left over, and that would be allowed to be used for the pool house. This is a pretty common calculation that you would do on an addition project or if you're building an accessory building on a lot. So first, the allowable floor area, remember, is going to be the lot area, which in this case is 300 feet times 125 feet. And then we will multiply that by the floor area ratio of 0.3. That number comes out to 11,250 square feet. But remember, that's the maximum that is allowed total on this site, and we've got an existing house that's going to stay. So we now need to find the existing. And looking at the site plan, we've got a 2-story house with a 4,100 square foot footprint. And then we've got a 1-story section of this house on the rear. So be sure to count, we need to count that 4,100 square foot number twice because it's a 2-story house. So we're going to do 4,100 square feet times 2 plus 800 square feet, and that equals 9,000 square feet. If we simply subtract 9,000 from the 11,250, we would have 2,250 square feet left over, which is over the 800 square foot maximum. So this floor area ratio requirement is not going to govern the size of it. In order to comply with both of those, you would need to build a maximum size pool house of 800 square feet. So this is not going to be the correct answer, but we still need to look into the maximum impervious area, which in this question accounts for both structures and the pool. So we're going to use a very similar strategy. We're going to find the maximum allowable. First, and then we're going to subtract out the existing to find out what's allowed to be used for the pool house. So allowable is going to be the lot area, which is 300 feet times 125 feet times, in this case, 20%. And that is going to equal 7,500 square feet. Sorry, just checking my notes here. And then we'll find the existing, which is going to be a little bit of a different calculation than we did from floor area ratio. So floor area ratio, we took into account that we have a 2-story portion. We doubled the footprint of the house. Here, we're just talking about impervious area. So that's really just the footprint of everything on the site. So we're only going to count that 4,100 square feet first once. So we have existing is going to be 4,100 plus the 800 plus the pool, which is 25 feet by 75 feet. which comes out to a total of 6775 square feet of existing. So again, if we subtract the 7,000 minus the 6775, we'll come up with an allowable, sorry about that. Get back there. We'll come up with an allowable of 725 square feet based on the impervious area. So since that's lower than the 800 square foot absolute maximum, in order to comply with all three of these requirements, floor area ratio, impervious area, and the absolute maximum, the maximum allowable pool house area is going to be 725 square feet. I did mention some erroneous information. These setbacks required here are really not factoring in. If you, first of all, there's no information in the question about if the pool house would need to be within the setbacks or not. Second of all, there's no dimension here of how deep the house is. You could probably assume that anywhere in here you could build a pool house that looks to be a pretty large area and a lot bigger than 725 square feet just visually. So I would say don't stress over this information being provided and not being used. It's very common on the ARI that happens, and in this case, it is not applicable. So we'll move on to question 3 here and do some zoning calculations. So again, we'll refer to the exhibit. An architect is working with a developer client on a new multifamily housing project in an R5 zoning district. The lot is 65 feet wide and 100 feet deep, and it's got neighboring lots on 3 sides and frontage on John Street. Which of the following is compliant with the zoning requirements and uses all of the available floor area? Kind of a different style of question here where it's not a fill in the blank question, but you're still going to have to do some math and figure out which of these options complies with the zoning requirements. So, and there's also not a diagram of the lot here. This question is going to require you to read it and sort of understand what's going on this site without a drawing, which is not it's not what architects do, so it might feel a little frustrating, but it's definitely something you should practice so that you can answer questions like this on the ARE. So really quickly, we can sketch this lot out. It's going to be 100 feet deep and 65 feet wide. This will be John Street, kind of irrelevant, but we'll write it down. That's 100 feet, that's 65 feet. And you're probably wondering, where do we start here? I think there's going to be, just looking at the chart quickly, there's going to be a few things that we need to consider to figure out which of these is compliant. First of all, the question says that the client wants to use all of the floor area, or actually it doesn't say that, but you should assume that in any question like this. Secondly, there's both lot coverage and setbacks, and all of the question choices list a square footage for a floor. So we're going to need to check if the size of the floor is compliant with both of these requirements, which is kind of like the last question where we need to find the most stringent requirement and comply with both. So let's take a look at the setbacks first. We've got side setbacks of 5 feet and a rear setback of 30 feet, nothing in the front. So if we draw that side setback, it's going to be on both sides. Sorry about that. Those two, sorry, I have some left-handed problems with this tablet. Those two side setbacks are 5 feet each, so 10 feet total. That's going to result in 55 feet of buildable width on this site. Similarly, the rear setback of 30 feet, if we subtract 30 feet from 100 feet, we'll get 70 feet of buildable depth, in this case, on this site. So if we multiply those two numbers together, 55 feet by 70 feet, we're left with 3,850 square feet for a footprint based on setbacks. We also need to consider the lot coverage number. That could be a different number, and if it's lower, we'll need to comply with that. So let's analyze the lot coverage quickly. So lot coverage, we'll abbreviate coverage. That's going to be the lot area. So we can do 100 feet times 65 feet times, in this case, 65%. And that is going to result in 4,225 square feet. So in order to comply with both of these requirements for how big our footprint can be, we're going to need to use this number, 3,850. It's lower than 4,225. So if we build footprints that are that size or smaller, we'll be in compliance with both of those. So we can already cross out the first option here. That's not going to be correct. And then the second option actually has exactly that number. That's interesting. And the third option is a little bit lower of a footprint. So either of those are still possibilities, but we're going to need to look at the floor area to figure out which one of these is using all of the floor area. So floor area ratio times lot area is going to be the maximum floor area. So again, I keep doing that. 65 feet times 100 feet times 5.0 is going to be 32,500 square feet. Okay, but neither of these choices tell us how many, how much floor area is being used. We'll have to do some multiplication to figure that out. So choice B, 8 stories at 3,850 square feet. I'm just going to write that total out here. I'm not going to write out the math, but if you do the math, it comes out to 30,800 square feet. And option C, if you multiply 9 stories by 3,611, you will get 32,499, which is just 1 square foot less than 32,500. That's usually close enough for the zoning ordinance. And since it's less, that's obviously okay. So I would pick the last option here. There's nothing in this question that talks about maximum height, so you don't have to worry about it being 9 stories versus 8 stories. And it ultimately fits a little bit more square footage than option B. So I would say that that is the correct answer. I think it's important to realize that when it comes to zoning, you're not always, just because the maximum footprint of a building in this case is 3,850 square feet, that doesn't mean you have to build 3,850 square feet. That would take a lot of the design element out of architecture if we simply designed buildings based on what zoning allowed us to do. So it's obviously allowed to build a little bit less so that you can distribute the floor area in a way that works for your design and for your client's needs. And that's essentially what this particular question is getting at. And there's the correct answer, the last option. All right, moving on to question 4. There's a lot here. I would definitely suggest reading the reading the question before you read the exhibit, because you'll understand, you'll be able to parse out some perhaps unnecessary information in the exhibit and do some underlining and things like that to figure out what's necessary. So here it says an architect is working on the renovation of a historic theater building in Times Square, New York. The corner lot has 32 feet of frontage on Broadway and 100 feet of frontage on 46th Street. Since the property is a corner lot, client wants to place a sign on both street frontages and wants each sign to be exactly the same. The client wants the sign to equal the minimum required area so that the building stands out amongst the neighboring buildings, which all have large signs. Which of the following diagrams indicates a compliant illuminated sign? And I've got the diagrams on the next slide. So kind of interesting, zoning doesn't just control the things that we talked about earlier, things about building form and use, but there are also some minute things like signage that zoning can control. In this case, in Times Square, that district of New York City is known for having really big, bright lights and signs. So the New York City zoning resolution actually not only encourages it, but requires that new buildings have these types of signs. And in that way, zoning is being used to create a sense of community and really make sure that the neighborhood is being built according to historically what it's been and according to what, in this case, visitors to New York City expect when they go to Times Square. So I think before we read the exhibit, I think we can sketch out what this lot looks like, because just like the last question, there's not a sketch here. And I think it'll be helpful to think about what this lot looks like. So it says here we have 32 feet of frontage on Broadway and 100 feet of frontage on 46th Street. So it doesn't matter what orientation we sketch this in, but I am going to draw it this way. Broadway here with 32 feet and 46th Street here with 100 feet. This is not a real scenario. 46th Street and Broadway is the New York Marriott Marquis Hotel, but just a fun site to consider for this kind of unique zoning ordinance here. So let's read the exhibit with this site in mind. So this is the special Times Square signage requirements. The provisions of this section shall apply to all developments and enlargements on zoning lots between 43rd and 50th Streets with street frontage on Broadway in the theater sub-district. Well, we are between 43rd and 50th Streets. We're on 46th Street, and we do have frontage on Broadway. So this does apply. This sentence is really important in a zoning ordinance to tell you if something applies to your situation or not. On the ARE, you're never going to get an exhibit that's provided that is totally not applicable to your situation. So for our purposes here, I'm glad that we read it and we're thorough, but this section definitely applies to our question here. So number one, at least one illuminated sign shall be provided for each ground floor establishment with street frontage on Broadway. Again, that's just saying that a sign is required. The question already says that the client wants a sign. So kind of irrelevant. It's not telling us any information about what a compliant sign design might look like, which again, when you're reading this exhibit, always remember the question we're looking for, and I'll just give a preview of what the diagrams look like here. We're looking for a compliant sign design. Number two, in addition, illuminated signs shall be provided with a minimum aggregate surface area of 25 square feet for each linear foot of street frontage on Broadway, up to the first 40 linear feet of street frontage. I'm going to stop there. We'll read the second part in a second, but that is going to be applicable information. That's going to tell us the minimum size of our sign. And if you remember, the question says the client wants the sign to equal the minimum required area. So we can just do that calculation now. And this requirement is saying that for the first 40 feet of linear frontage on Broadway, we need 25 square feet of sign. So since our site is only 32 feet on Broadway, we could simply multiply 25 times 32, and we have an 800 square feet minimum sign. So that's our first requirement. Finishing where we left off right there, the required minimum aggregate surface area shall not exceed 1,200 square feet. It's going to be irrelevant. It's important, obviously, to the zoning ordinance, but since the question says the client wants the minimum required sign, we've already determined that that's 800 square feet. We're not going to get anywhere close to 12,000 square feet. Finally, reading 3, no portion of any illuminated sign shall be located further than 40 feet from Broadway. So 40 feet maximum on side street. looking at the site plan here, somewhere in here is going to be 40 feet since the lot is 100 feet. So you could start to imagine the sign is going to be somewhere like this on the corner, and we don't quite know how big it is. It could be all the way to that 40 feet mark, but it can't pass this 40-foot mark. That's important. And just to close this out with a B, the sign cannot be below 10 feet above curb level or above the top of the street wall of the building, whichever is less. So looking at the choices here, and I've got some cliff notes on the right that summarize this pretty well. That last requirement is simply saying that no sign can go above the street wall here, and they cannot be below 10 feet. None of these dimensions are below 10 feet anyway, so not the most relevant requirement. So I think with a question like this, you're going to spend a lot of time figuring out what the requirements are. But then just looking at these choices here, I think the answer is relatively straightforward. So remember, we came up with here 800 square feet minimum for the sign, and then we said the client wants the sign to be on both street frontages and the exact same sign on both street frontages. So if we've got 800 square feet minimum for the total sign, and we know we're doing sort of an L-shaped sign, we want a 400 square foot sign on 46th Street. So we'll keep that in mind. Just looking through these choices, the first option here is way bigger than 400 square feet. 65 by 22 is huge, and it's also the 40-foot dimension from Broadway is probably somewhere in here. So this whole area of the sign is not compliant. So this option is incorrect. B, this looks pretty good because 20 by 20 sign is going to be 400 square feet. We know that the sign is only 20 feet off Broadway, so that 40-foot line is somewhere here. That's compliant, and we are 12 feet above the street height, not above the street wall. So I would go with option B as the correct one here. We can talk about the last two and why they are incorrect really quickly. So the lower left option here, a couple of reasons why it's incorrect. One, the total sign is away from Broadway. You would need a sign somewhere in this area to be compliant with the zoning requirements. This one is way off the corner and not compliant for that reason. It's also a little bigger than the client wanted. They want the minimum allowable sign size, so that one's incorrect. And then the last one is actually compliant with the zoning resolution. You've got this 40-foot number. It's 40 by 20, so it is 800 square feet. So it meets the minimum requirement. It meets the height requirements, 20 feet and below the roof, but it doesn't meet the client's requirements. So this question is asking you to consider both the client's requirements and complying with zoning. And that's why B is correct and not, I guess, D in this case. The two options on the left comply with neither the zoning nor the client's requirements. So just a fun question about signage with our black spectacles building in Times Square. Not sure why we would do that, but a fun question. So we'll go to the last question here before Q&A, and this one is kind of a long one. I'll read the question and then we'll talk about how we The site is 75 feet by 100 feet, and the following is known about the zoning requirements. Got a couple of floor area ratio requirements here. We've got 6.02 for residential, 1.0 for commercial, and a note that the total building's FAR cannot exceed the higher of the two FARs. That is important. So basically, the total building cannot be more than 6.02 FAR, meaning that you can't build 6.02 of residential plus 1 of commercial for a total of 7.02. If you're tuning in from New York City today and you're familiar with New York City zoning, these numbers are probably familiar, and this requirement. These are R8 zoning in New York City requirements. This next requirement's probably also familiar, this density factor of 680 square feet per residential unit. Density factors are a way that zoning ordinances govern residential use in terms of what I was talking about earlier, that concern in the early 20th century in New York, where there were tons of apartments really being crowded into buildings, and it was really unsafe and just unpleasant to live in these buildings. So many zoning ordinances in cities and New York City and specifically have these density factors so that the absolute limit of residential, there's an absolute limit on the number of residential units on a particular site. It's not abundantly clear why we need that information yet, but it's in there, so let's just make a note of that. Finally, parking requirements. There's going to be one parking space required for 40% of the residential units. Maybe now it's making sense why we have that density factor. And one parking space per 500 square feet of commercial space. So now the question, the client wants to build the largest building possible and wants to maximize the commercial space size. The client also wants to build the maximum number of units allowable. This client wants it all. And how many parking spaces are required is the question finally. So it's going to be, we just read all of this. It's going to be confusing about where you should start on a question like this. So I would, even though I read this forwards just for the sake of discussion today, I probably, if I was taking the exam, would have read the question first. How many parking spaces are required? You can also note that the fill in the blank question is asking for a number of spaces, and work backwards. So how are we going to figure out how many parking spaces are required? Well, in the third bullet here, we know that one space is required for 500 square feet of commercial space. We know that the client wants to build the biggest commercial allowable, and we've got a 1.0 commercial FAR. So that one should be relatively simple to figure out. We also see in the last bullet that we've got one space for 40% of the residential units. Again, with that density factor and the FAR and the lot size, we should be able to figure out how many parking spaces are going to be required for this building. So I'll just move on to my next page here with some cliff notes and a little bit more space for me to write. So I don't know, let's start with the residential because it's a little more complicated. So the residential, we need to first figure out the FAR. So we've got a 75 by 100 foot site. That's a 7,500 foot site. And remember, we've got a 5.02 residential FAR. That is the actual residential FAR of 6.02 minus 1 for the commercial. That's because of this note here that the total building has to be 6.02 or less, and that the client is going to want to build that 1.0 of commercial space. So that's an easy place to trip up on this particular question. So we're going to multiply the 7,500 square feet by 5.02. And we're going to come up with 37,650 square feet. So now we know how many square feet the residential building will be. Parking is required for a certain percentage of the units. We're going to need to use that density factor to figure out how many units we can have, and then finally how many parking spaces those require. So if we take 37,650 and we divide that by the 680 square feet per unit, we are left with 55.36 units. Since we can't have a fraction of a unit, we're going to need to round down here in order to comply. 55.36 is the maximum. If we provide 55, we're compliant. If we provide 56, we are not. So we are going to have 55 units. Finally, we can take that 55 units and multiply it by 40%. One space is required for 40% of the units. So 55 times 40% is going to equal 22 spaces for the residential only. This is residential. So now we will look at the commercial requirements. So again, we're going to do the same strategy. We don't need to consider the density factor because simply the zoning resolution requires one space for 500 square feet of commercial space. So we've got a little bit of a simpler calculation here. And I'm going to underline that 22 spaces, sorry, so I don't lose it. So 7,500 square feet. The FAR is 1, so I probably would not do the math on the area to save some time. So 7,500 square foot lot with a 1 FAR is a 7,500 square foot commercial space. And we've got one space per 500 feet. So 500 square feet per space. And that equals 15 spaces. So if we simply add up 22 spaces and 15 spaces, we get 37 total spaces required. Yeah, I think that is the last question here. So we can get into the Q&A portion, and Lauren's going to join us again and help us go through some of these questions.
Yes. So I'm just gonna rearrange here. So people have been posting in the Q&A, which is amazing. So you can actually go in while Chris reads through the questions. You guys can go in and upvote the ones that you would like him to answer most that you also had. And then Chris, if you want to read through and see if there's any, I think there are a couple that were clarifying some of the questions that you had. So maybe we could start with those.
Sure, yeah, let's just, I guess we can do this one at the top here. So in the second question, why did we have the first calculation? So let me get back to that one. If I remember correctly, I did the floor area ratio calculation first. So I guess what's being asked here is why did we do that calculation if it didn't end up governing how big the pool house could be? And I think the answer is that we couldn't have known that it doesn't govern how big the pool house is going to be until we went through that exercise. So it's if you started with, even if you started the opposite way, if you started with impervious area first and you came up with 725 square feet, that's not necessarily the correct answer just because it's less than the 800 square foot absolute maximum. You still would need to check the floor area ratio because, for example, if this floor area ratio was, I don't know, 0.15, well, not even 0.10, that would, I haven't done the math in my head, but that would probably make floor area ratio then the governing thing here that governs how big the pool house can be. There's no, I know a lot of people ask about rules of thumbs for things or for certain there's question types. There's no rule of thumb for this. You need to, just like when you're doing a zoning analysis in your office, you need to go through all of the requirements and figure out which one governs your situation. You can't look at a question like this and say, oh, it's about an accessory structure, so impervious area is going to govern. That's just not how it is. Let's see. I'll just keep going through these then.
Yeah.
What's the difference between use group and occupancy classification? So I touched on this a little bit in the beginning, but use group is a zoning term and occupancy classification is a building code term. There's a lot of confusion about these two because they are very similar. And I think you just need to remember that sort of the vocabulary terms here, that use group is related to zoning. I don't know, maybe like The letter U is pretty close to the letter Z in the alphabet, so you can remember it that way. And occupancy classification is related to the building code. I guess O is closer to B, so you can remember it that way. I just made that up. But otherwise, they're pretty similar. I mean, use group is just the term that that zoning ordinances tend to use to talk about how a space is used. And again, they're mostly concerned with having compatible uses near each other in neighboring buildings. So if you think about any place you've probably ever been to that has zoning, there's usually like neighborhoods that tend to have relatable things near each other. So I'll talk about New York City. The East Village and the West Village are very residential neighborhoods. They have commercial areas on main streets that tend to be wider. Midtown has huge offices, so does the financial district. That's not by accident. That's because the zoning in those areas says that you can build offices in Midtown and residential in the villages. So zoning uses use groups for those purposes, really. Occupancy classifications in the building code are used differently, and they are really used from a life safety perspective. I guess the best example is if you think about H occupancies, high hazard occupancies. Those are, usually chemical storage or things like that. Pretty dangerous, relatively dangerous types of occupancies when you compare them to, say, residential. There's a lot less danger inherently in a residential occupancy other than like cooking or something like that. So the building code breaks occupancy down into those terms to have different requirements for them for fire safety, also for egress. If you think about an assembly occupancy, there's going to be between 7 and 15, one occupant per 7 to 15 square feet, depending on if there's standing room or tables and chairs. You're going to be really tightly packed in an assembly space like a theater. Residential, not so much. You're never going to be standing in your living room, except like on a very rare occasion, with shoulder to shoulder with people. So there's going to be less people in a residential building vis-a-vis the square footage. So the egress requirements are a little bit different. So that's kind of the short answer, maybe not so short answer about how they're different. And try that mnemonic device that I made up.
Remember. I like that. Mnemonic devices are very helpful for me.
Yeah. All right, why did I subtract 1 from 6.02 in the last question? I was expecting to get this question, so I'm ready for it. It comes back to this. I tried to star this very heavily to avoid, so I wouldn't get the question, but it's okay. It's confusing. It comes down to this point, which says the total building's FAR cannot exceed the higher of the two FARs. So if we here multiplied the lot size by 6.02, we would come up with a higher number here for the total residential FAR. We would then have 7,500 square feet for the commercial portion, which would result in a building that was too big. Basically, if you make this 6.02 and this 1.0, the total building's FAR would be 7.02 and therefore not comply with this provision right here. This is really common in mixed use districts, which are super common in large cities where you'll have a commercial space on the ground floor and residences above. You see that all the time, particularly on main streets in cities. And it's just a way that zoning ordinances typically work, because some people might build a fully residential building here. So they might build 6.02 FAR totally residential. Some people might build 0.5 FAR of commercial and 5.52 FAR of residential. That adds up to 6.02. It gives you some flexibility in how you and some design flexibility to the architect as to how you would divide these allowable FARs while still sort of protecting the idea that the whoever put the zoning ordinance together doesn't want buildings that are bigger than 6.02 in total. Okay, so that's that one. Thank you for that question. Let's do this one from Jonas. So why in the first calculation was the pool not calculated and it was in impervious areas? Good question. Let me just get back to that one here. Yeah, we can stay here. So looking at the second bullet point for impervious area, it specifically calls out that pools are part of the impervious area. And then looking at the first bullet point here, it doesn't mention pools, but it does mention a few things that do contribute to floor area. So you shouldn't, since pools are not specifically called out as being part of floor area, you shouldn't include them. Pools typically are not, or I'm not aware of a case anywhere where they are part of floor area because they don't, they're in the ground. They don't physically occupy a space. Similarly, lower basements and cellars are not usually, well, cellars anyway, are not usually part of floor area because they're below grade. Remember that the point of a zoning ordinance is to control how a building is perceived from the street, how big it is, how big of a shadow it casts, and what types of uses are involved. So below grade stuff is not contributing to floor area, which which is used to govern how big a building is. Just a point of clarity here, a lot, if you're looking at a zoning ordinance, usually there would be a definitions section that would define floor area in a really long definition that would tell you exactly what is and what is not included in floor area. That definition in New York City is super long. So the ARE can't really do that unless it's a case study question and they provide, large excerpts from a zoning ordinance. So what I had to do when writing this question was try to paraphrase what you should and should not include. That's always a challenge with zoning questions because there is no standard zoning ordinance that you need to know.
Cool. We got a little baby follow-up question to that, which is, do porches and balconies count in floor areas?
Great question. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depends on who wrote the zoning ordinance and really what they were trying to achieve. I've done a number of projects in the Hamptons, and some towns count porches, covered porches. Some towns don't. If you and so in real life, you need to look at that definition that I was talking about, and if you're working in a municipality that you don't usually work in, make sure that you're not that you don't have this like memorized definition of floor area because it might not apply in that municipality. For the ARE, they should do what my question here did and spell out what's included and what's not. If they don't, I would probably not include a porch. I guess it's not really a fair question if they don't tell you, but I would think the most basic definition of floor area is the area of the building itself. So I guess stick with that if you get a frustrating question that doesn't define it, but I hope that doesn't happen.
Hopefully not. All right, I think maybe we have time for one more quick one before we wrap up.
Yeah, let me scroll through here and see if there's, none of these are upvoted, so I'm gonna pick one.
Yeah. At what number does the ARE or reviewers, so basically we had a couple of questions about rounding and we did some rounding today, so I'll just address rounding quickly. Let me go to an example here. If I can find one of the examples where we rounded. I think it was the last question. So yeah, here 55.36 was the actual number we came up with for the number of units, residential units that were allowed on this project. And we rounded that down. It so happens that mathematically you should round that down anyway. But even if this number was 55.99, we would need to round down in this case because what this is saying is that the absolute maximum that the zoning ordinance is going to allow is 55.99 units. So 56 is not allowed. It's simply higher than 55.99. So you have to round down. The same is the case for egress requirements. If you're coming up with a fractional
if your egress calculation is telling you need 50.01 inches of width, I'm just making this up, but 50.01 inches of width, that's the minimum. So you need to round that up. I mean, you can make it 50.01, I guess, if you wanted, but I would do at least 50 and a quarter inches or something like that, probably 51 inches if you're not doing fractions. You kind of just, I would say there's not really a hard and fast rule on this again. You need to use some logic and think about what the requirement is really getting at. If it's saying that there's a certain factor for number of units, for example, it's setting a maximum. So you need to be below that maximum. If it's for egress, it's setting a minimum required width. So again, you should round that up. So I guess there is kind of a rule of thumb. I'll take it back. You should round the opposite way of the intent of the requirement.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, we are at time, so that is it for today, I think. Just a reminder that our next ARE Live is going to be on July 20th, and we're asking for your topic suggestions. So this chat will be available after the episode is over, so go ahead and drop your ideas in there, or like I said, there'll be a community page for this episode as well. You can post them in there. And finally, I'm about to post a survey, so if you could take that and let us know your feedback about this episode or your suggestions for any future ones. We read all of those comments and we use them to make these episodes as helpful as they can be. Thanks for watching.